Let's get started. It's 12:05 Central Time, 1:05 Eastern Time. Welcome everyone to Rethinking Property Relations, Politicizing Site Analysis. We're very excited to have all of you here to engage in the workshop and the subsequent discussion that will come from it. My name is Jessica Garcia Fritz. I am a member of the Academia Working Group. I am the organizer of this particular session, along with Jean Baker, who is out in the audience. And I want to acknowledge that I currently reside in Oceti-Sakowee lands, which are the homelands of the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota peoples, as well as relatives. I'm a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Nation, and I belong to the Itazip-Shoayate. And personally, I'm really excited about this topic and this session for those reasons. And before I introduce the workshop and our facilitators, I will touch on a few points of Zoom etiquette, consent, and guidelines. We are later into the week, so many of you are probably already familiar with what these guidelines are, but it's always very good to rehash what those might be. So a bit about Zoom etiquette. We prefer for everyone to have their video turned on. These are workshops. They're very much participatory. So we like to see everyone's faces. Of course, this is if you are comfortable. But we also ask to take care of yourselves, either 2-hour-long sessions. So please take breaks, eat, drink if needed. And of course, if you do need to step away, please turn your video off. You can add your pronouns as part of your Zoom name, and the directions for doing that are to the left. So just click on the participants. You can rename and add your pronouns. Respect the person who is speaking. Keep chat to everyone to a minimum. Of course, mute your microphone when you're not speaking. I think one of the #1 rules is that when we get into the questions and answer parts, or when we're in a discussion, please type stack in the chat and we'll call on you. If you have a direct response to a question or a comment that someone had made, you can also type stack in the chat and add direct response that you want to address that. A note about the workshops and the recordings. All workshops are going to be recorded and shared with anyone who is registered for the 2022 ABC School. So if this is something that you're not comfortable with, of course, you can turn your video off, and you can certainly rename yourself. But we will be posting these on Luma. And finally, discussion guidelines. Make sure to acknowledge, use, and respect people's pronouns. Use I statements. Don't assume you're speaking for others. Listen carefully to what others are saying, and of course, assume good faith and positive intent. And ultimately, respect the spirit of the progressive stack, the workshop agenda. And remember that this is something that is very much a democratic process. Organizing is very messy, and so this is something that we are okay with. And so this is something that I think most of you are here to participate in. So I will stop the share here. Now to the workshop. Rethinking Property Relations is a workshop that seeks to denaturalize the ways in which sites are understood in design studios by engaging with questions of land ownership, histories, and theories of property and class relations between site professionals such as architects, developers and planners, and their putative clients and users. Some of the questions coming from this, there's a primary question: how might tracing regimes of ownership, such as settler colonialism or financial capital, challenge and politicize contemporary design pedagogy? There are 2 readings for this workshop. The first is Land Education, Indigenous, Post-Colonial, and Decolonizing Perspectives on Place and Environmental Education Research. The other is Commons Against and Beyond Capitalism. And both of these readings are located on Luma. And I'm going to put a link to the library for those of you who would like to reference the PDFs during or after the session. Now to the facilitators. The facilitators for this workshop are Manuel Schwartzberg Carrillo, Juliana Maxim, Jean Bilsel, Rebecca Choi, and Selena Martinez. I will introduce who they are and where they come from individually, and then I'll pass it on to Manuel. Manuel Schwartzberg Carrillo is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of California, San Diego. His research addresses the history of architecture in relation to settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and decolonial futures. Juliana Maxim is an associate professor in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History at the University of San Diego. Her new work is on the history of housing in Southern California. John Bilsel is professor in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History at the University of San Diego as well. Most recently, Bilsel co-edited with Juliana Maxim, Architecture and the Housing Question. He is currently working on a series of essays on urban protest, resistance, and memorialization. Rebecca Choi is a postdoctoral fellow and visiting lecturer within the Institute for the History and Theory of the Architecture at the ETH in Zurich. Her work explores intersections of architectural agency, power, and labor practices through Black material production. And finally, Selena Martinez is a faculty associate at the Arizona State University Design School in the architecture program and is an architectural designer for the ASU Indigenous Design Collaborative. Her academic studios integrate the use of 3D laser scanning and indigenous bioclimatic desert design responses. And with that, please help me in welcoming our facilitators. And Manuel, I will turn the platform over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you to everyone who has organized this week, which has been very, very inspiring. Thank you all for coming to our session, this workshop, Rethinking Property Relations. I'll briefly give a little bit more of a broader introduction, and then we're going to be presenting, the facilitators will be presenting for 5 minutes each, and then we will have an open discussion with everyone here in the workshop. Following that, we'll go to breakout rooms for further conversation and to think about our learning objective, and then we'll have a roundup discussion at the end altogether. So as Jessica was mentioning, I'm teaching at the University of California, San Diego, which is on the unceded land of the Kumeyaay Nation, which is a nation that spans and precedes the US-Mexico border. We have a few projects ongoing. I have in particular a few projects ongoing to try to get the university to be more accountable to the Kumeyaay. There's a very bad relationship between the university and the Kumeyaay, not surprisingly. And that is one of the connecting points for the talk in the sense, for the workshop, in the sense that John and Juliana are also in San Diego in different universities, but also obviously on Kumeyaay land. We've been talking for a while about our respective interests through the lobby and outside of the lobby. And so we took this school as an opportunity to think together a little bit. And the one thing that we kept coming back to was this question of property. We were interested to consider questions of ownership, but also from multiple perspectives. And to that end, we were very keen to invite Rebecca Choi and Selena Martinez to join us in this conversation, to also expand a little bit what we mean by property, which to our mind extends questions of distribution, or goes beyond questions of distribution that would take the nation state as a given, to actually ask questions around, well, what is the nation state? What is sovereignty? What is the sovereignty that underpins property, right? So that's all pretty big. More concretely, how do those things, how do we deal with those questions and problems through very practical moments and practices, such as what we call site analysis, which is such a foundational component of design studio. I think everyone has, at some point, if you're an architect, done a site analysis, usually touching on things like topography, vegetation, sight lines. Maybe you will incorporate some social dimensions like demographics, some cultural aspects, but really nothing that would go to the core of questions of why is the site owned in a particular way? Who determines what that regime of ownership is like? How is that enforced? and then who gets to profit in unequal ways and who gets marginalized in unequal ways given those regimes. So these are the types of questions that we are seeking to ask for this session. And in particular, we want to ask our learning objective. We want to ask you to help us and to help each other to formalize or to gather information around our learning objective, which is to politicize site analysis. So how would we politicize it? What are the means and practices of doing site analysis that would go beyond a kind of descriptive approach, how important that is, towards actually constructing solidarities? Solidarities among whom, between whom, on what grounds, on what epistemological grounds, on what media grounds, on grounds for what? What is the relationship between site analysis and praxis, political praxis, in the sense of an analytic reading of a situation that is part and parcel of a process of organizing or mobilizing for political change? How does site analysis inform organizing, and vice versa? How does organizing perhaps also constitute a form of site analysis itself? So those are the types of questions that we had. I won't talk for much longer, so we have time for these short presentations, where there will be about 5 minutes each, and then we'll reconvene all together here for about half an hour conversation with everyone, where we can have a discussion before breaking out into the breakout groups. So I would love to introduce Juliana Maxime as our first presenter.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I wanted to thank Jessica, Selina, Manuel, Rebecca, John, and everybody else who's making this possible, as well as the audience. Let's see. I think I want to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see the parcel map? All right. San Diego is where John, Manuel, and I work and live. And as Manuel mentioned, this is part of the ancestral land of the Kumeyaay, who until the arrival of the Spanish missionaries in the 18th century lived as horticulturalists, hunters, and gatherers over a territory that included multiple ecologies, including the ocean and its very varied coast, forested mountains and deserts. And according to patterns of seasonal migration and resource management that were closely attuned to the availability of water. The Spanish, Mexican, and American colonizations tried to erase Kumeyaay communities, and this was done through an approach to land based on the notion of private property and the related techniques of surveying, parceling, recording, buying, and selling that we continue to use today, and which I hope we will discuss here. So this is by way of introducing a kind of experiment with a studio brief that my colleague Shannon Starkey and I have been working with for the past 2 years at the University of San Diego, where we teach undergraduates in a pre-professional architectural program. So like in most architecture studios, we assigned a series of sites, but instead of moving on to designing a project, we built the studio around the seemingly straightforward set of questions: who owns the land, and through what mechanisms was that ownership established? So architects usually know the answer to that question in its most immediate form, because often, though not always, the current owner is the same as the client, even when the land is publicly owned, right? But we kept asking the question over and over, pushing back in time and asking students to investigate property records and historical chains of events that led to the site's contemporary land use and legal structure. So the point was to come out at the other end with a notion of site as a set of relations between people rather than between, let's say, the owner and the land, but also between a person and a thing. And as a more general and ambitious goals to find out how property became inscribed in modern law and ingrained in social and physical conventions, right? So in the US, retracing the history of how the land was controlled and managed inevitably leads back to the fact that we live on unceded territories of Native people. And I think some of the facilitators today are going to talk about that. But some of the important findings of the students were that this initial and ongoing form of dispossession of native land exists alongside many other struggles over control of the land, right? So some of the mechanisms that students uncovered and which shaped in very concrete ways the sites they were investigating. And here I want to say these are specific to the US, and perhaps one of the questions to ask if to the people in the audience who are not from a US context, how does that look for them? So some of these mechanisms were, for instance, redlining, and maybe some of these are familiar, but I think the work of the studio was to make it extraordinarily specific to a site. So redlining, which is a practice of the real estate industry that designated poor, Black, and other minority neighborhoods as too risky for investment. And students found ongoing traces of that practice in, for instance, the existence of food deserts. Another mechanism was that of eviction, super important. And here I want to shout out, let's see, I'd like to link to a document of resources. I'm going to put it in the chat. So this is a big list of resources that I hope we will collectively expand today. It's just the beginning. So I was talking about eviction and a reference to the anti-eviction mapping project. So eviction, we found it sometimes on an individual scale, sometimes on a vast scale of eminent domain. For large, often federally funded infrastructure projects, such as the Chicano neighborhood of Barrio Logan, that was forever altered by the construction of a highway. We found the traces of racial covenants. And here again, please take a look at the extraordinary project put together at the University of Minnesota in the wake of the George Floyd murder called Mapping Prejudice. And so racial covenants were ways to put in the property title the exclusion of certain certain racialized groups, Black, but not only. So that, this is an example of the how structural racism intersects with real estate and land use. And when those racial covenants became illegal through the Fair Housing Act of 1968, zoning changes, super important, such as the ones that happened with a Black residential area in the prosperous coastal neighborhood in San Diego called La Jolla, where zoning changes after 1968 led to the Black community being dispersed and erased. And very few people know today that La Jolla had a Black community. So the question also was, how do we move from this kind of awareness to action, right? So our hypothesis was that every one of these moments of taking and maintaining possession of land was also a moment of contestation when communities, tenants resisted and struggled against these mechanisms. And that if we can uncover how these contestations happen, we can learn from them. And we can start looking at the urban and non-urban environments as these repositories of forms of power and conflict rather than property lines that seemed settled once and for all. Thank you very much. And I'd like to now introduce Rebecca Choi. Stop sharing.
Hi, thanks so much. I just stuffed a strawberry in my mouth as you were transitioning, so excuse me. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here, and want to echo the gratitude that Juliana extended. Let me share my screen. And I've been thinking, can everyone see? Okay, great, thanks. I've been thinking about this term site analysis alongside some of the research that I've been doing on the term field work as it came to hold new meaning in urban-oriented design education. And my focus has really been on how visual techniques were developed to display information gathered from field work, and I would say by extension site analysis. And a quick qualifier, I do think that there is a difference between field work, which has a long history in sociology, and the term site analysis that we're questioning and grappling with this afternoon. But for the purposes of this short presentation, most of the content I'll be showing you is visual output from what is called field work, but I think very instrumental and useful for us to think about in the questions that we're grappling with today. So I'll show you two visual works, one map and one diagram, both created by the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who published his landmark study of an area in Philadelphia called the 7th Ward, what Du Bois named the Black 7th Ward. And I'll share with you literary critic Saidiya Hartman and Alexander Wahile's reading of these works, both of whom have been instrumental, at least for me, in helping me critically analyze the visual conventions of photographing, diagramming, mapping, documenting of information that we in architecture often use to present our observations. And oftentimes we present it in a manner that forwards itself as an accurate representation of certain observations, as having a truth factor to them. And what Hartman and Wahile in reading Du Bois helps us see is that Du Bois created a visual convention that presented data in a way that captured the complex and changing realities of a Black neighborhood. And I think this speaks to the kinds of things that Juliana was talking about in terms of how do we sort of create relational practices of site analysis. So Du Bois mobilized what he called systematic field work, which included in the study of the Black 7th Ward in Philadelphia, walking down South Street, observing street life on Broad Street, interviewing families on Pine Street, and he amassed 800 hours of interview data on things like educational attainment, health patterns, leisure activities, divorce rates, and things like criminality and mortality. Statistical data that sounds sort of typical for us today. And he began translating his data sets into over 200 charts, maps, graphs, and diagrams, two of which I'm showing you right now. And what I'd like for us to emphasize, or what I'd like to emphasize for us, is how Hartman and Wahile helps us see how Du Bois drew relational counterpoints to fixed statistics. Data sets that he gathered that oftentimes is presented at first glance in a manner of that has a kind of fixity. But when we look closer, Du Bois is actually creating a convention that shows relationality. So for example, in this map, there are a number of ways we can read the colors that Du Bois is using to fill in the outlines of the buildings. One way is to see Du Bois as kind of prone to the assumptions of his time that this neighborhood is a space that has what he himself even categorized as vicious, criminal, criminal cases or poor. And those are in the legend outlined in blue, green, red, and black. And Saidiya Hartman, however, reads this map as not simply showcasing these categories, the poor, vicious, criminal, middle class, the working class, but in fact showing relationships. Hartman demonstrates how Du Bois's map reflected residents' morality and aspiration and need in a manner that operated like a moving picture. She said she calls this map, quote, as a moving picture, a living image, a story in motion. In other words, we can read the red, green, black, blue as glittering representations of bodies moving in space rather than just fixed data of a particular category of people living in the Black Seventh Ward. So for Du Bois, in this project of the Philadelphia Negro, he writes, even before he writes The Souls of Black Folk, he's developing a visualization of Black life in a way that is constantly moving, not freezing Black life into stereotypical data sets in a way that perhaps mapping projects, especially at the time, such as, say, Charles Booth's poverty maps did. The second diagram I want to share with you has been beautifully analyzed by Alexander Wahile in his text titled Diagrammatics as Physiognomy, W.E.B. Du Bois's Graphic Modernities. And Wahile teaches us how Du Bois's use of visual data was an intentional tool to abstract the realities of Black life from the data that underscored the color line. So Wahile argues that Du Bois was trying to put forward a methodology that resisted the ways in which Black life was depicted and coded and represented in these kinds of statistical charts that reinforced racism. For instance, in this, Black men are out of work, the stereotypes of or racism that call for Black females as predominantly prostitutes, or that Black neighborhoods have statistically low educational attainment rates. All of these kinds of statistics that reinforce the color line for him was not true, and that his diagrammatic visual conventions were pushing against these frameworks. So Wahile points out that Du Bois is, at least in this diagram, creating descriptive diagrams to encode racial formation and abstract realities that pushed against racial color coding. So for example, the quote that I've highlighted for us in blue on the left-hand side of your screen, I'll read out loud. Wahile describes how Du Bois, like the map of the Seventh Ward, consistently produces descriptive and relational diagrams. And he says, Du Bois, quote, distributed ink ratio equivalency. Let me start over. Du Bois distributed ink ratio equivalently among Philadelphia's populace, detaching the darker shade from the Negro as an embodiment of negativity by associating the color Black with men, regardless of their race, as a sly maneuver and just formed by the horizontal orientation of charts and the vertical positioning of Black above white folks, unquote. So I hope you can see in Wahile's reading of Du Bois, indeed, Du Bois's sly diagrammatic maneuvers that for us, the reader, we can see he's refusing Black narrow categorization in the way that Du Bois uses color coding of Black as not an indicator of Black bodies, but as a graphic motive to describe men, full stop. Then of course, the horizontal configuration in the graph allows for Du Bois, according to Wahile, to place Black folk above white folk. So I hope in these two examples, it gives us some tools for us to think about diagramming in a way that could push against the way we visualize observations as static informations when we visualize site analysis. And I hope I forwarded this as kind of food for thought, and for us to learn from Du Bois and aspire to draw relational counterpoints as opposed to presenting fixed statistics when we carry out site analysis. And I'll pass it over to our next presenter.
Thank you, Rebecca. Really fascinating. Hello, everyone. So I'm really delighted to be part of this event and participate in Architecture Lobby's ABC School. I want to talk a little bit in relationship to one of our readings. So I'm not sure if the participants here, you had a chance to have a look at the readings that we suggested. One of them that actually really intrigued me quite a bit, and I benefited quite a lot from, is by George Caffentzis and Silvia Federici's Commons Against and Beyond Capitalism. Okay, so let me share my screen. I hope you can all see it, right? Architecture and urban design studios rarely analyze their project sites as contested spaces. I want to ask today two questions as part of our prompt. How to introduce our students to site-specific histories of conflict and contestation, and what types of solidarities can be constructed out of politicized analysis, as we call it. So you may be familiar with the word Meydan or Maidan. I spelled it out actually at the bottom of the slide here. That's the word that actually comes to my mind when I think of an urban public space in a crowded city center. So there was, for example, the Maidan revolution in 2014 in Kyiv, where people toppled the pro-Russian regime. The Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt. It is not a square, but in Arabic, the Maidan of Liberation. Taksim Square in Istanbul, where the massive Gezi protests began in 2013, is also not a square, but it is a Maidan. So a quick search actually revealed that the word Maidan or Maidan is an originally Persian or Farsi word, which we also find in Urdu, Arabic, Turkish, Ukrainian, and in many East European and South Asian languages. I think Maidan means much more than a town square. To bring something forward in the Maidan is to reveal a secret and to expose a crime. And to call someone to the Maidan is to challenge and contest authority. The implications of the word is stronger than making it public. Maidan is contested space, it is political in a quite oppositional sense. In fact, not having a word for Maidan in English limits our political imagination. The word for public space, for example, is taught in distinction to private property. This led some to argue that the public is a modern abstraction, perhaps a creation of the Western bourgeois modernity, in contrast to a decolonial anti-capitalist notion of commons. I am quite intrigued by the way one of our reading embraced commons as a space outside of, and at times in opposition to, markets and the state, and therefore, as authors call it, quote, commons against and beyond capitalism, unquote. I can give many examples from the text if you're interested later. The distinction that Caffentzis and Federici make between the commons and the public, and I quote, for example, the public is a state institution, is controlled by the state, or again, quote, The public is managed by the state and is not controlled by us. The authors seem to subscribe to a communitarian anarchist view of the political. Going back to the word Meydan, and when we stop thinking of the public in contrast to private property in English language, the opposition the authors see between commons and the public, commons on one hand, the public on the other hand, it becomes harder to take for granted. An urban space can be a liminal space, both commons as a space of solidarity and a space of public contestation and public exposure. The protests that began in 2011 in Tahrir Square, the Arab Spring, the Gezi protests, and Occupy, they practice a strong anarchist streak, no hierarchy, no representation. Public spaces were taken over by impromptu commons, a community library, makeshift clinic, and open-air assembly, and even kitchens, and complete with sometimes communal vegetable gardens, but they all also took place in a Meydan. So I wish to speak to this compelling example I've been showing you slides of, the Saturday people in Istanbul. They have gathered on Saturdays at 12 noon in Galatasaray Meydan since 1995 in the busy 19th century center of Istanbul. Every week they commemorated a victim of state violence and enforced disappearance. They are not an organic community. The public space where they gather is not their community space. It took decades for people to gather there every Saturday and to make the space their own. They were violently ejected, barred from the square, and forced to gather elsewhere in 2018. So this relationship of spaces is kind of important, I think. The dirty war of the 1980s and 90s in Turkey took place in other spaces, in either faraway provinces, predominantly Kurdish, or actually in the outskirts of the city, Istanbul. There is a topography of terror where the tortured bodies were found, if they were found at all. Every Saturday, the Saturday people cross the entire city, often from predominantly migrant neighborhoods in the outskirts, and travel to the city center, to a Meydan which has become theirs. The collective commons and the public are not in opposition to one another. The exposure of the public space is what the commons need to protect itself from state violence. So maybe also a final word about how to politicize site analysis, our expected learning outcome today. The participants in the commons, they don't need architects to politicize their site. They don't need us to politicize their site. As a professional managerial class, we, the architects, the historic preservationists, public artists, are quite behind. We depend on the authority of expertise that the state can grant us in helping build the public space and create monuments of public memory, sites of memory. Yet that kind of expertise commands little confidence both in the commons and in the public Meydan, where in solidarity, people have taken things in their own hands. The Saturday people are the ones who memorialize, and they are the ones who design the spaces they occupy. They have a message to the public, I think. They demand public justice. And I find actually this very important because it's not only a commons of solidarity, but it is also reconstituted public justice. So I wanted to basically contribute these thoughts, especially after I read the readings for today. Thank you. And then now we are going to have Selena Martinez as our next presenter.
Thank you. I believe Manuel is gonna actually slide in before me.
I'll go now, and then Selena can go.
Sure, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chan. I wanted to talk a little bit about diagramming and the problem of representation, as well as a problem that inheres in discussions around site analysis. And one of the through lines that we're hearing has to do with who gets to represent, right? Who gets to represent what? Who gets to be represented? So this is a map drawn by Timara Lota Link, Chumash artist, showing the different indigenous nations in California. Some of you probably know that California was the most densely populated place in the whole of North America before colonization. It was a very thriving geography. There were, I mean, accounts vary, but at least 300,000 people before colonizers came in and started destroying the place. This map highlights specifically the different languages. So there were hundreds of languages spoken by people then. It was a very cooperative place where, because of the density, the different nations had to have commercial relations with each other, security relations with each other, diplomatic relations with each other. And it's quite an amazing picture in my mind of just another way of representing political geography and political relations. And so I'd like to contrast this map, which is so different to the map today, right? And we see a little bit of that in the outline here, with another map of a part of this territory, which is the Southern California jurisdiction for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the state institution tasked with managing native nations in the United States. This is from 1937, showing a map of the Southern California region, including 30 indigenous tribes. And you can see here very clearly how the land has disappeared. And what we're getting is a kind of orientation map of like the different relative positions of the different tribes, very forcefully mapped in relation to a center point. And that center point is the city of Riverside, which is where the Mission Indian Agency office was located. So this is the supervisor essentially mapping out how far away each one of these locations is from that office. And to me, it speaks a lot to the problems that we've been discussing, particularly the kind of flattening of, in a way, reality that takes place through colonization and through colonial management, where all of this incredible diversity basically gets flattened according to the prerogatives of colonizing agency. Like I said, the land really disappears here. The only measure of land is, in a way, distance, right? You see the numbers, the different miles from Riverside, and then the relative orientation to this point, which is a kind of 0 point, right? And this is a very important concept, 0 point epistemology. For those of you who read the land education text that we suggested, 0 point epistemology is essentially Western white supremacist epistemology. The idea that history begins, has a starting point in at some point in Europe. It creates time and space that expands from Europe outwards. And so the Americas are subject to this kind of imposition of time and space, whereby we know that in the Americas, there were multiple epistemologies and there were multiple ways of understanding time and of understanding space. So this is, to me, is a very important representation of this problem, and to really understand that this is not just an intellectual problem. This is a very practical issue of who gets to map and who gets to decide what the relationships are, the relationship between politics and territory. I'd like to contrast this map to a map that happened, or a diagram that took that was drawn just a few short years afterwards. That is a diagram I return to often in my thinking because I like it a lot, but it's also highly problematic. And to me, it showcases a little bit what modern architecture, how modern architecture lived and developed in this colonial context, which is, this is A. Lawrence Coker and Howard Dierstein's architectural center idea from 1943. It's an idea to centralize all architectural production in the United States according to these different 5 functions: industry, architects, engineers in private practice, architectural schools, public relations, and research labs. And this idea that the architectural center would be the place where all of these different fields of knowledge and professions would kind of be coordinated by these master architects, who would then churn out, you know, whatever housing is necessary, whatever factories are necessary, whatever parks are necessary. And I like it because it's a representation in a sense of how you might plan for needs. And I think that's a great idea. But again, what the diagram does is it centralizes. In this case, it centralizes the power of architects as being the ones who represent. And it also completely abstracts land, and it completely abstracts indigenous nations and the actual geography of the United States, the actual ecologies. And so to me, it's a kind of interesting, you know, you have a lot of this kind of narrative, again, with the Green New Deal today, right? Where the sovereignty of the United States doesn't come into question. The idea that it's professional experts who centralize the information, who monopolize that information, sometimes doesn't get called into question. And the idea that we are still on colonized grounds and we are still part of a colonial system does not get called into question. So what would it mean to try to redraw this diagram in place, on site, taking into account the actual people who live in these places? Today in California, there's more than double the indigenous population that there was before colonization. So it's actually an incredibly indigenous place. So how would we do this? This is the kind of challenge that I see, that I want to explore with this conversation around site analysis. So I'll pass it on now to our last speaker, to Selena Martinez.
Thank you. Happy to be here with you all. Once again, my name is Selena Martinez. I'm Yaqui and Chicana, born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm here in the O'odham and Peeposh territory in Tempe or Phoenix, pretty close, but the same territory. I'm going to share, after reviewing the readings and just trying to wrap my mind and connect my work to what the topic is about politicizing site analysis. One of the things that we often come across in the Indigenous Design Collaborative and a lot of the studios that I've participated in is the importance of making sure or ensuring that students are able to connect to whatever the project is in a deeper level beyond the surface. So the place-based education that was spoken about in one of the readings was really easy for me to digest. And I think when we're thinking about site analysis, it's really important that we understand these as living entities or ecosystems, and they're not just stagnant when we're considering the different interconnected layers. So for me, I started to just diagram what I was just all my thoughts around this topic. So I think what this type of education, this place-based education can provide or expand for students is establishing more parameters for design so that it's not just this objectified object way of approaching design, and it goes beyond into the additional layers. So typically, you know, we consider the physical factors, which you can see here on the right, and then the cultural factors. I feel we often don't give enough time for that or give enough space in our studios due to the time that we have in a semester when we're considering site analysis. one of the things I want to touch on is one of the things that actually one of my professors told me when I was in architecture school in my master's program. We were doing a project, and typically there's this project always in South Phoenix. If you're familiar, this is an area that was historically pushed out a lot of brown, Black, and non-white people essentially to a specific area in Phoenix. And for some reason, architecture school likes to do a lot of projects there and, make it about the community. But I think a lot of the struggles that I have with that as somebody who was born and raised here in Phoenix is that, these bureaucratic institutions often never consult or, actually find a way to establish a genuine relationship with these communities that they're researching, which I think, that shows, the real reality of working in these institutions, of there not being genuine relationships and connecting design further into communities where we can actually assist and give students real applied experiences. There's always this fear that, there's going to be a negative output from it. But I think one of the things that now that I'm starting to lead studios is really, with my social capital in this area, trying to connect community stakeholders with students so that they can actually experience that before they graduate. And in relation to that, it's when we do that and we have these speculative design creations, it's more of like an experiment, which, for Indigenous people and for people of color, that's never a fun history to discuss, especially when it comes to institutions and bureaucracy and cities and many of the things that the other speakers already kind of touched on. Even if it is speculative, we need to make sure that we're avoiding this savior type of mindset when we are considering design and what is appropriate, so that we can lead towards a direction of activism and advocacy for community versus we know what you need as architects or designers. Because historically, even just in general knowledge is, like many of the other speakers mentioned, is typically validated or put out there by the dominant society, and it's not led by people who are being analyzed. So you can see at the bottom in green, I've added another layer to what would typically be site analysis, which is Indigenous relationality. And the three kind of areas that I added is language, which I think is really tied to history, as well as storytelling, ways of knowing, and what is of value for communities, which kind of goes back to, like, how can we do community-based design or engagement in an appropriate way that actually acknowledges what is of value to these communities and what is of need to these communities when we're thinking about these speculative design projects, as well as cosmological aspects and land tenure and the way that communities have ownership over, or historically had ownership over places. So I think, within all of that, there's a plurality of identities that will be revealed in those explorations through projects. But I think, when we are doing these projects beyond site analysis, usually there's the output of architecture. And I think architecture has been, for the past decade, been objectified to objects and, these things that are more about ego than actually assistive for the communities. And I think that, in site analysis and all the different processes that occur or overlap during trying to create an architecture, we need to treat it as a ceremony, as a sacred process, because architecture is heavy when we place it in communities. Just like going into a community and doing site analysis, that has an impact on the people we're interacting with, depending on how those relationships are conducted and the genuineness of what that actually looks like as it's happening. And to kind of finalize all of this, the fact that architecture is heavy, that is that generational impact that everybody is mentioning. all those different aspects, whether it's on the macro scale or the micro scale, affect a community's well-being and the future generations, whether that's Indigenous futurity or a multiplicity of different populations moving towards that common ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. We're kind of running a bit short on time, but I think it would be important to open it up now for everyone for any questions or comments. So if you want to, maybe we can do 10, 15 minutes at least before breaking out into the groups. So if you have a question or comment, please put your name on the chat on Stack.
Peggy, you're on Stack.
I guess I just want some further clarification of Manuel's comment that if we're looking for how to implement these observations or implement this kind of site analysis into our schools and into our city, we should look at the fact that they all these mappings indicate contestation, which I take to mean that we're participating in contestation once we introduce these into our programs, and that we should be prepared for contestation. Am I reading this correctly?
I think that's correct. I'm kind of curious to hear what Juliana thinks about that, just because Juliana is currently chair of the department. And so in a way, you occupy a kind of contradictory position or complicated position. So if you don't mind, Juliana.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess one of our definitions of what it means to politicize, right, is to foreground. So instead of taking established boundaries, let's take boundaries as the most simple illustration of things, right, as set, to reveal them as the outcome of struggle, right? So the fact that they exist today meant that at some point in the past, somebody did something to someone else, who did what to whom, and we also assume that there was resistance, there was contestation, that there was struggle. I think some of the flatness that Manuel talks about is the smoothness of history, right? That assumes that, well, things happen in a certain way, and the point is to try and undo that smoothness and reveal these conflicts in the past, and that it's not just about bringing back silenced voices. It's about I think reanimating our own work today to say that what we do is probably, and I think that's perhaps more directly addressing your question, that what we do is bound to be, it's probably tied and conflicting, bringing up conflict in some kind of way, right? So I think that struggle remains today, and it's important to figure out who are we struggling against and who are we struggling with, right? So solidarities, but also oppositions. Sorry, a bit of an abstract answer. Did anybody else in the panel want to jump in?
Actually, I wanted to speak to Peggy's question too, but I don't want to jump the line. I see. Shall I go ahead quickly?
Go ahead, John.
I think it's a wonderful question. It's really key. how to include contestation or build basically architecture education around contestation. So in the reading that we recommended, and I was basically speaking to, Commons Against and Beyond Capitalism, they have a wonderful section in which they talk about how this idea of commons is kind of co-opted and domesticated by the real estate industry, and especially universities. Like, for example, next to our architecture department, they built this huge learning commons, right? It's called Learning Commons. And the whole idea, of course, is to give the idea that this is a safe space, meaning that you are basically safe from all sorts of discrimination and maltreatment. But when we create this idea of basically a bubble where you are safe, and it is free of contestation, free of conflict. For one thing, universities have incredibly, especially elite universities, have incredibly low tolerance for any kind of disagreement. So on one hand that, and on the other hand, basically how do you relate to basically the place that is San Diego and the spatial violence of it that surround us all, the spatial violence of the border. I mean, when you go to a place like Calexico, it is incredibly violent. How do you deal with that? And how basically even just kind of contest that idea that as if United States is rich versus Mexico is poor kind of duality that sometimes those approaches develop, right? And instead to show the incredible violence and poverty that is just next door. So I just wanted to speak to these. I don't know how these two come together. And I see that we have undergraduate students in the panel, so maybe they can speak to that.
Would any students like to jump in? We don't have to put you on the spot either, but please feel free to.
It doesn't seem so at the moment, but we're working on it.
Okay, great. Tom, you were next on stack.
Sure, thanks, Jessica. Great presentations. I wonder whether our focus on land is itself a Eurocentric bias. One of the things we've learned from working with Indigenous communities in Minnesota is that they don't see the land as the only thing that's alive. They see the air, the sun, the wind, water. There's life in all of that. And one of the, I ask that because, you know, even in Eurocentric notions of property law, you may own a piece of land, but you don't own the sun. You don't own the water. You don't own the wind. You don't own seeds. You don't own insects. You don't own birds. And so there's this vast commons that exists as another, all these other layers. And so I wonder if we're so focused on land ownership, we're actually perpetuating the very bias that of Eurocentrism. And that if we began to think about new kind of legal structures that would enable communities who all have access to the sun, the wind, the water, wildlife, as a new way of ownership. And I actually think it's particularly appropriate in the sort of given the ecological crisis that we're in, that in fact, these kinds of commons may in fact be as valuable or more valuable than the land itself. So I just wondered your thoughts about too narrow a focus on the land itself.
I can take that for a minute. It's a really good point. I think that the readings that we have suggested actually speak very directly to your question or to your point, which is the land education reading certainly says very explicitly when we say land, we mean the air, we mean the waters, we mean the animals, we mean our ancestors, we mean our future relationships as well, right? So land is a metaphor for all of that. And I totally agree. And the other reading, which was so amazingly concise and really points to this, as John was just referring, no? That the commons, even the commons itself, becomes a vehicle for co-option and for neoliberalization, right? Oh yeah, it's so great to have sun and to have air. It would be even more efficiently organized if we marketized it. And so I think that's the real kind of enemy. And this oppositional language, I think, is very, very important. I do think that the oppositional language, which is a kind of meta conversation, but I think it's an important one, because sometimes in conversations around land and indigenous peoples, there is a, not always, but sometimes people do bring a kind of like, oh, we're all in this together type of mentality, but we're not in it together. Some people want to patent seeds and want to monopolize seed production and seed distribution and seed patenting the DNA, right? And other people don't. Other people want to share that knowledge and want to make it be the intergenerational knowledge it is. And so I think that that's in a way where I see these two approaches converging. If you take some of the examples of looking at maps that we saw today, looking at regimes of ownership that do reduce land in this very problematic way, but do helpfully point out who is trying to do the monopolizing, who is trying to do the exclusions. So I see both sides of it. The importance of saying, yes, it's not just about geography, it's not just about the two-dimensional view, but yes, it is about establishing histories of who is doing the dominating and who is doing the excluding. I think that's very, very important.
Any other comments from the facilitators on that? Okay, Jean, you're next on stack.
Yeah, this actually changed what I wanted to talk about, Tom, because I'm very interested right now in the rights of nature, which is hopefully a successfully developing legal theory about this precise thing. And right now, wild rice, under its name in the area, is suing people are suing on behalf of wild rice, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and they're doing it in tribal court, and they're citing the Constitution because it protects treaties, and this tribes or treaty, I think in multiple treaties, they cite wild rice as a thing to be included and protected and under their ownership or curationship, something like that. I'm not sure the exact language. Yeah, though the other thing, they definitely are under our legal system, making seeds and probably birds at some point under ownership, because there were farmers who lost a lawsuit. They were suing Monsanto for having Monsanto seeds blow into their farms and growing in genetically modified Roundup treated seeds, and they lost and were in copyright or patent infringement.
I have a quick direct response to both Jean and Tom. Tom, I think what you said is quite beautiful. I want to say a few things about this legal framework, right? Because I don't know, I listened to somebody explain to me how a river could be, under a legal system, assigned personhood, right? After all, if a corporation can be a person, why not a river? And then, therefore, as a person, that river could have rights and enjoy protection, right? And that is a very moving, beautiful thing. However, I've also listened two legal scholars who work, and Manuel knows this in and out, but who work on the question of water in the Coachella River Valley, and speak of contestation. That is one very, very important and very sort of poignant conflict about control of the water rights and the aquifer. And as I listened to these legal scholars, I realized that they are fighting for a understanding of the world that is simply not possible in the legal system the way the legal system exists now, which was from the beginning set around notions of private property, right? So I can see our current legal system deployed in good ways, but I can also see how it is completely limiting our possibilities of, sort of reimagining the world.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I mean, we're working with legal scholars, lawyers, and tribal communities around developing solar commons and water commons with tribal communities. They are actually taking back these common resources, and we're developing templates that would still be recognized in the judicial system. So.
I just have a quick direct response to that as well, because I think, I think one thing that we can all do is look at public policy and certainly tribal sovereignty. And I think, part of this is also paying attention to some of the like the Supreme Court cases. The one from the recent session, Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta, is a huge one because it's redefining tribal sovereignty, and the relationship has always been with the federal government, and now there's a question. And so these kind of arguments have been happening throughout for the past century, couple of centuries, and they're happening right now. And so I think these are all, this is an important conversation in regard to certainly policies, both federal, state, and certainly tribal. Let's continue with Stack. I think we're going to end with the last question from Cornell, but Kadambari is on Stack. John, did you want to, I know you were on Stack, but yours seemed to be a direct response. Did you want to jump into the conversation before?
No, I already spoke to that question.
Perfect. Okay. So Kadambari and then the Cornell Architecture Summer Studio will address those. You can answer the two questions before we move into the breakout room. Kadambari, go ahead. You're on Stack.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This is a fascinating discussion, and there's so much to talk about. But thank you for bringing all these issues on the table. One quick response, and I'll try to make this quick, is while we're talking about critical legal scholars, etc., one thing that comes to mind, first of all, the sort of, if you're problematizing land or property, we also need to problematize the notion of ownership, right? I think a lot of your representation, the examples you showed are already sort of, I think kind of hinting. And I think, and certainly I'm not an expert in critical legal theory, but what comes to mind is this very, notion that the legal scholars have advocated, that property is not a thing, but a bundle of rights, right? So that already then starts, us to challenge, how do we represent a site, a property, which is a thing, which is material, etc., right? So I think your examples are really, really fantastic in terms of showing that idea. Now, and it also says it's not a right, it's a bundle of rights. And so if we were to go towards that, what is interesting is that the rights are bundled differently, different people have different rights, etc. But if I could connect that to some of the comments that Manuel and John already made, I think, and I hope I can bring this back to what architects can do, because I'm quite taken by John's challenge to us that architects don't have a role in this. And I think this is what we're trying to do in this school, trying to figure out what architects can do. What do we have a role in, what, etc. So I think if these things, what we're talking about as, if we problematize the idea of ownership by showing these kind of immaterial social relations, and then if we also agree that rights have to be defended, and can architects do that? I don't know if we can, but if I can, since we are talking so much about legal theory, etc., I just want to quickly say that when there were issues of immigration, under Trump, like, at the airports, or DACA and all those kind of issues, lawyers and students immediately went to the airport and tried to defend, tried to give them kind of consultations. And I'm sort of trying to think about what would be the parallel for architects to do that? Like, what would architecture students do in this kind of debate? Or, when you were example of Tahrir Square or whatever, and of course in New York, we think about Occupy, which is in the same map. And I think that some of it is just that some of those examples have been forgotten because, they haven't been drawn or mapped in a way that we can understand the complexity of the conflicts that Juliana is talking about, right? So I think some of it is like, how do we go beyond representation and mapping to sort of start thinking about what needs to be defended and what, as architects, as what can we do in a way to sort of, think about all these issues. So I don't know where I'm going with this on the spur, but I would like to, think about also just sort of the notion of ownership, as a kind of, and link it to this idea of, site analysis in a way.
I can start. Jessica, is that okay? Yeah. Kadambari, fantastic comments and questions. I wonder actually if the group here has read is Cheryl Harris' well-known article, Whiteness as Property. It is actually a reading that is so extraordinary, but made me also understand so many things about what the legal system is, and this whole idea of like how, for example, whiteness be construed as property, right? And I think that completely has the potential of deconstructing the liberal ideology that underpins the legal Anglo-Saxon legal system. I mean, I'm not an expert of that, so I will leave it there, but I would recommend, if you haven't, all of you to go and read Whiteness as Property. About basically your question, I think, yes, what I'm saying is that basically people in the commons, in building their solidarity, they don't need architects, right? I wouldn't just delude myself to think that, I am in any way needed, right? In this extraordinary practice that they have put together in the last nearly 40 years every Saturday, right? But I am also saying that they did not only just create a community of solidarity, only a commons, but they also are interested in reconstituting the republic. They want, out of the contestation, they want to recreate the political. And there is the idea of the public. And I think as any citizens, then we have a role to play. So it's not only about professional ethics of how to be, of course, aware of it if you are designing, but at the same time, as any citizens, I think we have a role to make sure that actually their willingness to be heard, their willingness to basically recreate the public, we can contribute to that. I don't know, is that making sense, Kadamba?
And for the sake of time, I think we'll keep moving to just the final question. And then that will give us time to move into breakout rooms and come back for a report. So the Cornell Architecture Summer Studio, you all have a question.
Yeah, no, I'll try to keep it brief, and it's slightly different topic change in a way, which is kind of reflects our situation. So this is just a group of 11 students who are taking a summer studio here at Cornell, various undergrads and one graduate student. And from a kind of very pragmatic academic point of view and a kind of question, I think that for us, like in this particular context, we have 8 weeks that we're delivering a studio, right? And the students have several assignments and are asked to do certain things. And I think the engagement that's been discussed, which I think is amazing and so needed on both kind of questions of community that you're working with or connecting to and engaging with a place and a locality, but also questions of representation. And so I guess my main question is like how or what needs to be reconciled to be able to foster those real deep relationships, understanding of a place in the community and its history, but also what's happening there now and the contestation that's been happening and continues to happen in certain places, and how to kind of reconcile that with the, in a way, arbitrary structure of what is a semester, right? What is 15 weeks, or in our case, 8 weeks, and how to actually sort of begin to make those connections and those understandings that are necessary for all the reasons that were mentioned. And I think for me, it's like a question of having to also rethink what expectations are for a studio in particular, and what are students actually asked to produce. And I think so much of the time there is an expectation to produce a project or an architectural response to X, Y, and Z. And in some ways, I'm all for that, but I think it's also something that is maybe needs to be questioned. And I would be interested from the people who have been speaking if there are other examples or recommendations or kind of things that they've seen as a way to sort of work against or at least challenge some of the typical expectations of what an architecture design studio is supposed to produce, and sort of what they can produce within a certain time frame relative to some of the much deeper kind of questions, connections, relationships that I think all the speakers are suggesting need to be formed.
I have a quick response just from my recent experience working with urban Yaqui community, which is my tribe. Luckily, I have the culture capital because I'm part of the tribe. So I could be considered a stakeholder or somebody who can help connect those pieces. So I would say finding interested stakeholders who could participate. Obviously that depends on their capacity, but maybe inviting them to some of the reviews and, like things like that when it's related to real feedback that the students could actually begin to integrate, whether it's super engaged or not. I think it's one way to start initiating some of those relationships for future studios, because obviously this is a generational thing that will come over time, and relationships come at the speed of time and take time to develop, especially with institutions, depending on the existing relationship. But I would say one of the things that I did was I didn't have any architects at our review. There were just community stakeholders. And I think that change of dynamic for students as well, especially from their past, I'm not sure if these students have had past experience of traditional reviews and critiques, was a whole different experience for them. Obviously you can decide on how that happens for your studio, but I think it was way more productive, and they were able to actually throughout the semester have a relationship with those stakeholders by having them at many reviews and introducing them, and having those stakeholders introduce the students to their community or to that environment, which I think was a really positive experience for the students I interacted with.
Sorry, if I can add very quickly to that. I'm from Canada at the University of Calgary, and what we're doing is we have studio selectives rather than electives being separate, and those run in parallel with studios, and they're taught whether by all the different, with the equity, diversity, inclusion, whether it's accessibility, whether it's with some of these rights so that you don't settle, because often you get a lecture by somebody and then you move on and you settle into the typical thing. So it's somebody who's constantly throughout the semester, as you're doing your studio, keeps weaving back the questions and information.
I really don't want to stop the conversation, but we will have to move into breakout rooms. There's opportunities to continue this in Luma as well. Manuel, I'll set up the breakout rooms, and if you want to explain how they'll work, I can begin to set them up.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So we're going to move out to 5 breakout groups, and the idea for the breakout group is that we'll be discussing the learning objective, which we decided is politicize site analysis. So we'll have 15 minutes for a conversation where we can share resources of successful or interesting or problematic examples of politicizing site analysis. So how do you do that in studio or outside of studio? Can we gather some institutions, some organizations, some specific authors, some specific communities or methods, approaches that we want to learn from? So this is a kind of creating of a list. Each group will have their own Google Doc. So you write down your examples in conversation with your group on that Google Doc, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for a quick report back. So if each group wants to select or volunteer somebody to do that reporting, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I will assign. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully the breakout rooms conversations were good, productive. I am going to place into the chat the 5 different Google Docs based on the room. And John, I'll have to repost yours because the link didn't come through. We have about 15 minutes left, 10 to 15 minutes. And so let's hear what came out of the sessions. Manuel, I'll let you facilitate.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for doing the session, the breakout. I think that we can start with group 1, who was John's group.
So we had Michael Abrahamson from University of Utah, Kadambari Baxi from Barnard, Lina Bondarenko from San Francisco, and Nina Tiu, who is a student at University of California, Berkeley. And Michael very kindly volunteered to actually quickly talk about what we discussed.
Sure, I'll try to be brief here. We began with a conversation about continuing the conversation around the Maidan as a sort of etymological phenomenon, including the mention that in Hindi, the word actually means something like grounds or field. So it's a, let's say, a broader linguistic phenomenon than even was revealed in the presentation earlier. Kadambari offered some perspective coming out of her experience at Barnard with their so-called Harlem semester, where students are always very adept, as she said, with uncovering histories, but they often have a hard time engaging with the future of that place. And the questions that maybe emerged from that experience were, how do we teach students to sort of engage with the past while also imagining that future and avoiding sort of handcuffing their creativity psychologically, if nothing else, through the kinds of histories that they uncover. And then Nina offered a perspective from a recent course that she took where the students were offered various kinds of GIS maps that allowed them to map ecologies, but ecologies, it seems, was understood fairly broadly to include both the conventional ecologies of plants and animals and people, but also finance, existing stakeholders, et cetera, that resulted in a larger sort of map, a diagram that shows those ecologies in a very broad sense. So we didn't get to the point where we were offering any kind of learning objective necessarily, but those were the kinds of things that we talked about.
Wonderful.
Great, thank you,
Michael.
Thank you, Michael. So group 2.
Oh, that's our group. We had Manju Adikesavan, who is a PhD candidate at CUNY, and she kindly took notes for us. And we had Catherine Hamill, who is at University of Calgary, who will share our discussion points to you all. And we also had Lori Brown, who I think she had to drop off for something else at 3, who is at Syracuse Architecture and teaches studio there. And we had, we talked a lot about tools, but I'll let Catherine give you a summary.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we talked, one of the big questions was updating the tools that we have a lot of tools to our capacity, but why we're still limiting it to plans and diagrams, that we have videos, it's also to think of sectional qualities of site as way of representation, although we do that in some diagrams. We discussed also in terms of outreach and community engagement, if when we do put things like interviews on the table, that students aren't prepared to do that, and there are consequences. Now usually you have people, and in case there's repercussions or trauma, you have to have the psychologist. So it gets more and more complicated, and aware of the limitations, but maybe that becomes where more collaboration with people who specialize in these areas can happen a lot more, and that's starting to happen. We discussed a bit also, I'm from Beirut, where land is extremely contested, Beirut, Lebanon. What happens when the land edges, the sharp edges of landscapes are there, and what happens when the government or whoever is in power is chaotic in themselves, so that property is not only contested, but very malleable. And I think that would be a good example to showcase other extremes. Yeah, deep prioritizing the visual was a big one. And the last point of many we had, there was a good discussion, is also questioning whether students want that. Because you bring these things forward, but there are students who also just want to learn how most practices are still practicing and want to go and get a job and have those tools. So how to infiltrate that, I think, is important. So thank you. I don't know if somebody else from the group had anything to add.
Thank you, Catherine and Rebecca and everyone. I think group 3 was Selina's group.
Yeah, we kind of had a general discussion and a lot of just questions. I took some notes for us, kind of continuing from the main discussion as well about, how can those relationships be built with communities and academic projects, considering time in studios, how are kind of moving into how the students are relating to architecture, curriculum, and content, whether it's relevant to them or it's too abstract, how projects and design prompts as a process can be a model to take away into the future practice, and schools some schools preparing students to work for another architect, so to speak, and not really preparing them to lead in other types of conversations or participate in different ways in the architecture field, versus the traditional kind of trajectory. The influence of outside forces in architecture academia, whether that's other companies or partnerships kind of infiltrating the schools to help develop different ideations for specific projects that they are considering. what students want versus what professors want versus, what the institution want. Those are all kind of different, a plurality of different intentions for each of those groups and how that dynamic is happening within the different schools. Some of the students from Cornell also, kind of talking about their experience and how architecture education, should be a place for them to dream and explore, while also having a critical response through their architecture as they're learning. And then finally, how can we better prepare students with the tool set to respond to a plurality of or take different directions depending on their future in the field. So I think what that one was really getting at is like how, instead of just only preparing them for what the current field or industry is like, how can we give them a variety of tools to better take on their future in any direction that they hope to within architecture in general. I think that was mostly it. If anybody feels differently, feel free.
Thank you so much, Selena. Group 4, I think, was Juliana.
Yes, we were together with Bees and Alex and Sean. Bees is in LA, both a practitioner and a instructor at USC. I think Alex is at UPenn, and Sean is in New York working on the wicked question of affordable housing. And Bees very kindly agreed to report back.
Thanks, Juliana. There's a lot of resonance with what's been shared already. We're talking about the kind of massive gaps in design education as it stands. So, how do we prepare students for with the theory and practice and praxis grounding to even have that politicization? We talked a little bit about the work of Dark Matter University, who did present earlier in the week, and I'm an organizer and teacher with them. And we talked about, there's not going to be one right way or one solo way to move us all there, and the work has been ongoing. And but thinking about how to support students, again, as has been shared already, moving from what's the incredible work that's happening in education, so that they're supported in practice, however they choose. And so what kinds of field organizing that the lobby, for instance, is already doing, and other groups as well, to make sure that industry standards change, or just, the standards of the field also change, so that we're not immediately shut down by a client who says, why am I paying you to do this analysis in this particular way, right? That there's some sort of strength in numbers, that we're all agreeing this is really important and we're going to do it in our practice.
Thank you, Bees, and thank you, Juliana, and everyone in the group. So the last group was ours, group 5. We were, do you still hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, sorry. So we were Ipek Tureri, Roberto Amador, Sara Kantrowitz, and Olasumbo Alaniyi, and we discussed questions around the importance of program, particularly program that is not for conventional or normative or hegemonic property regimes, maybe something like decommodified housing. It would be an interesting way into the problem of site analysis. How do you analyze those types of legal relations? How does an understanding of politicized site analysis translate to programs outside capitalist power relations, and also how that relates to reparations? Ipek kindly suggested a foundational text that I was not aware of, called Agency of Mapping, which addresses site analysis and argues that it is a political and a foundational act of design and not pre-design. So everyone check that out if you haven't already. We also discuss how the definitions that we employ when talking about sites can be very political in themselves, depending on the context, and the importance of using different kinds of modes of representation, not just visual. So I think this is something that many of us have been discussing, the importance of incorporating performance, installation, spoken word, oral histories, and to think of ways of representing that kind of expand the typical architectural toolkit. And how might that in itself open up architecture as a profession, which is a very siloed profession. Another reference, La Paperson's A Third University is Possible, which very directly discusses pedagogy in relation to colonialism and decolonization. I think that sums it up. I'm not sure who was writing these last ones, but we didn't discuss them. So we'll wrap it up there. We're already over time. Thank you all so much for coming to our workshop. Jessica, do you want to say any final things before we conclude?
Sure, yes. Well, first we want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you to our facilitators, Selena, Juliana, John, Rebecca, and Manuel, for putting forth a fantastic workshop with so much to discuss, and hopefully that we can continue the conversation after this. Juliana, I think there's questions about the resources that you had provided, and so perhaps we can put that on in the library as well. The next session is questioning the nature of status in architecture. It starts at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And keep in mind that the workshops will continue into tomorrow and Saturday. And don't forget to join us for the closing plenary on Saturday, in which we'll discuss the learning objective that comes from this particular session. So thank you everyone for the conversation, and please enjoy the rest of the workshops. Thanks everyone.